Right, if we can then move on to the officer presentation.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start by expanding on Alid's introduction, just in terms of some details of the site. The site is an area of 4.7 hectares. It's within Brentford town centre. It's bound to the south by the River Brent in the Grand Union Canal. It's bound to the north by the High Street and London Road. Augustus Close forms the boundary to the west, with the Heidelberg building to the east. Further to the southwest, as you can see from the image in front of you, is Syon Park and House, including the Grade 1 listed Syon House. Kew Gardens World Heritage Site is to the south and east, beyond Brentford Dock, Ferry Quays and the River Thames. Ali's already described the proposals generally, but just to go into a bit more detail, the master plan proposes the demolition of a number of the existing site buildings, including the Vicarage County Parade, 81 High Street. It involves the retention of a number of buildings across the site, and I think the slide shown by the applicant demonstrated that, including the Motorwise building, 131 to 134 High Street, St Lawrence's Church, the NatWest Bank and Post Office, number 80 High Street, the Grinding Workshop and the Greaves Thomas building. The Magpie and Crown, the Brewery Tap, numbers 98 and 99 and number 79 High Street are also retained, albeit they're outside of the application red line. Redevelopment would provide, as a overall across the site, a mixed-use development of a maximum of 111,000 square metres with retail, residential, business and leisure uses. This includes a maximum of 876 residential units with associated landscaping, car parking, cycle parking and an energy centre. A standalone application relates to the change of use of St Lawrence's Church, as we heard before, into a gym, D2 use. Looking at phase 1 specifically, 323 residential units are proposed, 7,000 square metres of retail floor space, including a new grocery store within Block B, 120 commercial car parking spaces within Block B, as well as 42 residential parking spaces and temporary commercial and residential surface car parking during the construction period and prior to Block G, the multi-storey car park being delivered. Generally, phase 1 comprises approximately 40% of the overall development area. Again, we've talked before about the difference between a hybrid application, so detailed consent is sought for B, C and K. The remaining 8 blocks, we are only dealing really with the principles of those blocks. No detailed designs provided at this stage, but future development would be guided by a set of rules within a design code document and a set of parameter plans. These would be subject to future applications, we called reserved matters applications. These applications would also have to adhere to the principles in the overarching design and access statement and landscape strategy. The applicant talked briefly about the amendments to the scheme. Some were made during pre-application and some during the application. I won't go through them because they've already been done, but just a couple of the highlights would be a reduction in the number of residential units from 923 to 876, removal of part of Block A adjacent to St Lawrence's Church, various changes to Block C and changes to the design code. In addition, there's been a reduction in the overall number of parking spaces, which is in line with to meet the overall residential parking ratio, given that the 93 went down to 876. So in terms of looking at the assessment of the application in terms of the principle of development, the National Planning Policy Framework emphasises 3 key elements to sustainable development: economic, social and environmental, with new development to make a positive contribution to all 3. At the heart of the NPPF is a presumption in favour of sustainable development, which should be seen as a golden thread running through both plan making and decision taking. Overall, it's considered that the principle of a mixed-use scheme here is acceptable. It's in accordance with the site allocations in the BAP and the emerging local plan, and also in accordance with the wider BAP aspirations for Brentford Town Centre. Brentford is failing in its role as a district centre. It's lacking in quality retail floor space. It has a limited shopping and leisure offer. It suffers from a relatively poor image and poor quality existing floor space. It also fails to capitalise on its waterfront assets, which we talked before about a unique selling point, and obviously those valuable assets would be such. The proposals are considered to create a new retail, cultural and leisure offer for the town, transforming its offer and with the potential to enhance the vitality and vibrancy and potentially safeguarding its future. Up to 14,000 square metres of new A1 to A5, which is retail floor space, is proposed, over a variety of unit sizes and with a flexibility of uses across the site. And I know there's been discussion about whether D1, D2 could be this or that, and the outline application involves flexibility where those can come forward as and when. A supermarket is provided within Block B, which is considered to anchor that part of the site and help drive footfall, and again improve the offer, which obviously we've only got Morrison's currently. A new retail circuit would be created between Blocks B and C and linking up with Workhouse Dock. And there would be a significant net increase in town centre car parking, which would be maintained through the construction. The development would result in the loss of the temporary car park on the south side of the High Street, but this would be replaced prior to its loss with a significant net increase. The applicant's presentation talked about the wider improvements to the High Street, which would see increased widths of footway, increased crossings, enhanced connectivity with the north side, as well as pedestrian priority and a cycle priority. And that's there's a contribution secured of 1.5 million towards that. It will be subject to further consultation and detailed design once that contribution has been paid. There's been a lot of talk about a retail strategy. Currently, as it stands in the report, this would be secured for each phase prior to implementation as part of a safeguarding condition, having note of the applicant's offer in terms of the 20%, etc. We would potentially switch that to a Section 106 obligation to sort of tie in that offer, and we would look for the retail strategy, as I said, at each phase to work with the local authority in terms of confirming the mix of uses across, looking at temporary uses such as being described before, creating retail zones and looking at the incentives. As the applicant says, they've agreed to participate and contribute to the High Street Fund programme with the GLA. And again, that funding would also go towards events and meantime uses as part of the retail strategy. Moving away from retail, but still in terms of the uses for the town centre, approximately 8,000 square metres of leisure community floor space would be provided. Again, this supports the town centre and the retail floor space, encourages activity, nighttime use and general footfall, and potentially helps draw visitors back to Brentford or spend back to Brentford from surrounding centres. Again, we've talked about the potential plot in Block F, which is 5,000 square metres of D2 floor space, which could potentially be the site for the relocation of the Waterman's Arts Centre. Again, this large space would complement the retail offer and assist in reinforcing and raising the community, cultural and social role of the town in accordance with BAP Policy 3. It should be noted that this proposed development facilitates and does not preclude the potential relocation of Waterman's Arts Centre rather than actually providing its relocation. Section 106 contributions again would look to secure peppercorn rents and incentives for that use to be brought forward. Other leisure uses, including the gym, which would be within St Lawrence's Church, and the waterside proposals, which would be secured, waterside leisure proposals, sorry, which would be secured in the waterside strategy, would also support the wider town centre, as would an additional 4,000 square metres maximum of office uses, which again, flexible space would go towards really creating a vibrant offer for the district centre. We've already mentioned the net increase of jobs across the site, which would likely to be approximately 800, with the ES estimating over 400 for local people. The Section 106 would secure programmes for job brokerage and construction training to ensure local people can benefit from the new town centre offer. The development would enhance the image and offer and encourage visitors. There would be wider benefits, including an increase in spending in the locality, with the ES again noting a 7 million additional net spend. Overall, the quantums of floor space proposed are based on the evidence in the BAP and the emerging local plan and are welcomed. Moving on to residential, I think it's widely accepted there's a housing shortage in London. Indeed, the London plan targets for the council have doubled to 822 per annum. 876 residential units would make a significant contribution to these targets and would provide much needed housing choice. The location provision of residential within the site is obviously in accordance with the site allocation in the BAP and in the emerging local plan. And again, maximising housing delivery is in accordance with the aspirations of the London plan. We've mentioned affordable housing a couple of times tonight. And it's true to say that the London Plan requires the maximum reasonable amount of housing to be provided, and it is subject to viability. The provision of affordable housing is obviously a key aim for the council, and we've already mentioned the pledge of 3,000 affordable homes within this administration. I think one of the key points is that it is accepted and it is in policy that it is subject to viability. With that in mind, the applicant has submitted a viability appraisal which has been independently reviewed by the council's choice of valuer. The applicant's original suggestion of 10% of units, 10% of affordable units, which would have been located in later phases of development, raised concerns in terms of their deliverability, given that they would have been, well down the track and not tied to the initial phase one. Subsequently, officers have negotiated an amended offer, which involves the transfer of Block D to the council. This includes space for up to 80 units, includes the retail floor space at grade within that block, as well as 72 car parking spaces. The affordable housing would obviously be transferred then to the council and would be delivered by the council through its own house building programme, which is already well underway. In addition, the applicant as already previously described, would provide a contribution which is estimated around 7 million towards the shortfall in delivering this block. There's a number of benefits that we feel this approach secures. It secures the deliverability of affordable housing at an early stage, subject to getting permission. This could technically feasibly be brought alongside the delivery of phase one. It allows the council to provide a tenure mix that best suits local need. For some of you may recall that the Brentford Lock West development, a similar mechanism was used to deliver affordable housing as part of that scheme. In addition, a review mechanism would also retest viability at later phases, with additional top-up payments to affordable housing required if viability improves over time. Again, this is something that is accepted in the London Plan, and we've used on most of our major schemes, and they are providing returns sort of at the moment on several of those. The council would also sell its assets, County Parade, to the applicant for a separate cost and exchange at the same with the Block D transfer. The proposed terms of the land swap would be subject to planning approval. They're set out in the heads of terms attached to the addendum, albeit these are yet to be ratified by the council. Overall, it's considered that the development would provide the maximum reasonable amount of affordable housing and is policy compliant. So looking at the overall principles of development and the uses, it's considered that they offer significant benefits to the functioning of the district centre. The suitability of the site for a mixed-use scheme has been tested in the ES, and the mixed use of the site is considered acceptable subject to the mitigation secured within the 106 and safeguarding conditions. These include repairs and works to the flood defences, significant construction management mitigation, as well as contributions as already described to education of 1.8 million. Looking at the housing standards proposed, it's considered actually that there is a good standard of accommodation created. Internal spaces are generous in accordance with London Plan standards. Adequate internal noise protection would be provided, as well as reasonable access to daylight, with no north-facing single aspect units proposed. The units would be built to lifetime homes and wheelchair standards. Adequate privacy would be created between the buildings within phase one. The design code for the outline elements demonstrates that adequate privacy could be created in later phases through the use of dual aspect units, minimum separation distance, and the positioning of windows and balconies. In terms of amenity space, these would provide a number of forms, including communal courtyards, terraces and balconies. The provision is policy compliant with the Hounslow SPG, and indeed exceeds many of that found with other developments, which is welcomed, as is the amount of play space that I think we've alluded to previously. Safeguarding conditions on any consent would require that the standards are met and that the accommodation is delivered as proposed. Turning now to the design and appearance and heritage. I probably better have a drink before this bit. So good quality design is a key component of sustainable development. London Plan policies require development to be of the highest quality. The design and access statement submitted with the application defines the rationale behind the proposed design and how the applicant got to where they are now. The environmental statement also includes a townscape character and sensitive viewpoint assessment. To be clear, only B, C and K are proposed in detail. Approval for the principal, i.e. the maximum heights and position of the other 8 blocks is sought, but there is no detailed plans for those. And they were, as I've said before, not to labour the point, but they would require further applications and consultation as well. In terms of the existing site, it's considered that the Brentford town centre lacks cohesion, with high quality historic development fragmented by areas of lower quality. South side of the high street itself has lack of public realm, very narrow footways, is dominated by traffic, has poor connectivity with the north side of the high street, incoherent character, and generally buildings are dated and unattractive and provide a poor quality stock. And there's an image there of County Parade, which I think demonstrates several of those points. Within the main site itself, beyond the high street, many of the buildings are derelict and vacant and have suffered from vandalism. I think poorly planned piecemeal development in the past has disconnected the high street from the waterside. It's seen the loss of the majority of the historic lanes, or the loss of the majority of those individual lanes. It's resulted in buildings of limited quality and poor legibility across the site. Where there are buildings of merit, and there are some, their setting is compromised by poor quality surrounds and their own future probably in doubt, given that many are vacant and in decline themselves. The waterside environment has little public access, the basins are overgrown, workhouse dock is inaccessible and in a poor state of repair, and the waterside assets are generally hidden from view from the wider community. Indeed, if you're driving along the high street, you wouldn't necessarily know those wonderful assets are even there. And again, it's considered that without redevelopment of the sites, that the poor quality of the high street and wider side is likely to deteriorate further. The development proposals in front of you would obviously significantly change the appearance of the site. Given what I've just noted, I think that there's the general acceptance that change needs to happen. In terms of the proposed scheme, the urban grain and site layout has been carefully thought out. The proposals recreate the lanes where possible, linking the high street and the waterside with 6 north-south connections. There's an image there showing the increased connectivity between the high street and the site, which currently is lacking. The lanes have resonance with the history of Brentford. It's accepted that they don't follow the exact paths of some of the historic lanes, and there's various reasons for that. Obviously, many of the lanes have now been removed by poor piecemeal development in the past, and there is practical reasons in terms of creating an urban grain and site layout that actually works for a mixed-use development. The lanes would also obviously provide the visual connection with the water from the high street. The proposed site layouts create large areas of public realm, which currently there is obviously very little, including areas around the waterside. A new woodland amenity area would be provided to the south of St Lawrence's Church, again currently inaccessible. The heritage strategy has been talked about previously. Generally, it's welcomed the retention of many of the important heritage assets across the site, and the development safeguard their future. The St Lawrence's Church is obviously Grade 2 star listed and is on the Building at Risk Register, English Heritage Building at Risk Register, and the proposal to turn it into the gym offers the financial viability to save that building, and the work and in the addendum you'll see the safeguarding conditions that we require to ensure that work is done sensitively. Again, the motorwise building would be incorporated into Block B and would be restored to some of its former glories. So there is a loss of several heritage assets across the site, namely the Vicarage, number 80 High Street and the Wilson and Kyle building. These are discussed in further detail in the report. The loss is regrettable, but is accepted based on the overall scheme benefits. As part of the Section 106, a photographic history of the site would be undertaken prior to any work commencing, and I think that's an important point to note. Overall, the development would obviously reconnect the waterside and the high street and bring workhouse dock back into use. A waterside strategy within the Section 106 would ensure that the promised waterside enhancements and activity are provided, including the mooring infrastructure, and in accordance with the Blue Ribbon policies. I agree with some of the comments that Mr. Moore said in terms of there is a lack of detail in some of those elements at the moment, but given it's an outline scheme, I think that is acceptable, and the 106 would require these strategies to be put in place for each phase, and they would also require the applicant to demonstrate that the maximum use of these waterside spaces is being utilised. In terms of scale and mass, there's obviously a difference of opinions between some of the people in the room. There is no specific height mentioned in planning policy for the site in terms of heights. The application proposes, let's just flick back to this one, the lower image, lower heights along the high street, generally 3 to 5 stories, increasing along the lanes 5 to 7 stories, and 2 taller elements along the waterside. It is considered that the heights across the site are actually appropriate. The development results in a gradual transition of built form from the north, from the high street down to the water, Taller buildings would not therefore appear incongruous within their setting. The wider views of the higher masses along the lanes referred to would be limited due to their north-south orientation and the fact that the sides of the site are obviously bookended by Augustus Close and the Heidelberg building, and with Block B, I suppose, forming a bookend within the site itself. The scale of the site, which is obviously a large site, and its physical separation from the surrounding townscape through the waterside and the high street, ensure that development would have proportion and balance and would be relatively contained within itself. Looking at the high street in particular, it's considered that the lower heights proposed of the new elements, when taken with the retention of existing buildings, including the Magpie and Crown, the Motorwise building, the Post Office, the NatWest building, would ensure that an elevation that is not overbearing, that respects the existing high street scale, has a variety and interest and character with an interesting skyline. Amendments, and you can see from the images there, the overall elevation. Obviously, those buildings are just shown as blocks at the moment. In terms of F and E and the rear parts of D, they would be subject to reserved matters applications where you'd seek to break up the massing. And the image below is a CGI taken from the Magistrates' Court, looking back towards Block C and B. Amendments to Block C have reduced the mass along the High Street and created, in our opinion, a cohesive elevation. And you can see some of the images there, and again cross-referencing with County Parade. The existing two-storey warehouse adjacent to Block C would be retained and extended forward into the High Street, again creating a break in scale. The elevational treatment of Block D opposite of the finger block north elevation facing onto the Magistrates' Court would reflect the materiality, sort of reference from the materiality of the Magistrates' Court to reflect that building and that space. Again, in terms of the two taller elements, just in terms of Block G, which has been, I think, noted in some of the objectors' presentations. Again, this is in outline. The design code has been updated to give us confidence that the future delivery of that building would be high quality. It would have a materiality that reflects the resonance of the site. In this case, the example shown there is timber in terms of the working boatyard beyond. That there is active corners, that the building is set back into the site. And there would be views of activity through the elevation rather than just as it's predominantly a multi-storey car park. In terms of the taller elements, again, 10 stories for Block K, and Block H has a maximum of 10 stories. The emerging local plan is a material consideration, given that it's currently with the inspector and has been through consultation. This specifically notes that the subject site could contain taller buildings. These can serve to enhance legibility, for example, in this case, H and K demonstrating the waterside. They can allow height to be reduced elsewhere. They can create interesting skylines and interesting elevations, and also noting the policy notes that this is obviously a district centre. In terms of surrounding context as well, Brentford Dock opposite is 6 and 7 stories in part. Brentford Lock is 7 stories in part. The police station is circa 13 stories. Heidelberg building 7 stories. There is changes in height across the area. The viewpoint assessment in the ES has looked at the impact of the development. In terms of the outline blocks, this looks at a worst case scenario because they're just as blocks and in their maximum form. This has shown that there is an acceptable impact on sensitive views, heritage assets and adjacent conservation areas. The views there specifically from Kew, noting the significant separation distances, the fact the site is separated from Kew by Brentford Dock and Ferry Quays, and significant tree screening. Where the top of the buildings may be visible, this is not considered to result in any unacceptable urban encroachment, and safeguarding conditions in terms of H, for example, which would be the most visible in the top left image you can see there, you can barely see it. We would try and limit the fenestration facing onto the Q elevation in terms of to limit lighting. There would also be conditions on external lighting as well to try and reduce any impact in terms of light through the tree line. And these images are taken, well, it must be autumn because there's very few leaves on the trees. Again, looking at Block H, and just finally, the design code would ensure it's not 10 stories across its elevation, so the top left image is what it could look like. So the ridge of the building would be the 10-story element, and obviously the 10 stories is not carried out across the elevation. And it's an example of what the design code could facilitate for future developments. In the bottom right is Block J, as is as portrayed in the design code, showing the principles, but obviously those elevations would be drawn up in detail, and I'd expect, some of the variety in roof forms that I think some of the objectors are after would be provided as part of these final blocks. There's eight still to come. There's a lot of criticism of blocks B, C and K, and you've heard them, in terms of their size and scale, which I've talked about, but also in terms of their typology, which seems to be predominantly that they are flat roofed elements. It's my opinion that they do have resonance with waterside and warehouse buildings, and there's various examples you can find across London of such buildings. The B and C use their materiality in keeping with the surrounding context in terms of predominantly brick. Block K, for example, is more robust with metal cladding referencing waterside industry. And again, just taking Block K again as an example, with an exposed core between the two elements, elongated balconies, both reference chimneys and cranes that would have been features of past site activity. Again, as noted before, each of the blocks has been designed by a different architectural practice, and if you look closely at the detailed design, there's significant variety in their form and detail appearance, and each one plays a different role within the site as well. Additional variety is also provided by the retained buildings within Phase 1, which I've already listed, Motorwires, Magpie, to name two. Flat roofs, which again are not uncommon for industrial and warehouse buildings, also give the ability to use those roofs in terms of amenity spaces and green and brown roofs. And again, as I just noted, additional built forms and typologies could be forthcoming within the later 8 development blocks, with the design code and parameter plans guiding their development. The GLA and the Design Council CAPE support the application, and overall it's considered that the master plan would create a vibrant new destination with the potential for high quality buildings with diverse character and an appropriate scale, respectful of the heritage of the site, and provide a rich diversity in the public realm, rejuvenating the existing high street and creating an appropriate canal side setting. So there's still to come, I'm afraid. I'll try and make it brief. Again, because as I say, the report covers the impact on neighbours in more detail. Direct impacts are limited because of the separation of the waterside and the high street. It's considered overall neighbours would benefit from a new town centre, the new public spaces and the new services, as well as increased security through increases in activity and natural surveillance. There would be disruption during construction. That's potentially a necessary evil, but with the mitigation proposed in terms of considerate contractor and the requirement of construction environmental management plans, it's felt that these can be adequately dealt with. In terms of traffic and parking, the NPPF requires all developments that would generate significant levels of movement to be supported by a TA, and say that development should only be prevented or refused on transport grounds where the residual cumulative impacts of development are severe. We've already talked about the trip modelling showing a 6-minute delay in the peaks. It's important to note that the application also proposes capacity improvements at Brentford High Street and Halfacre Junction, removal of the traffic signals on Teller Road, and implementation of traffic signals at the Ham. In terms of the 6 minutes, that's a worst case scenario. It is a theoretical scenario. It was the assessment of officers, which is not just TfL, but obviously officers from the council as well, that impact was not severe. Subsequent to that, it's important to know that modelling was based on 915 car parking spaces. There was actually 50 less as a result of the reduction in the residential floor space. So the 6 minutes is more than a worst case scenario. It would be reduced by the reduction in parking. So overall, it's considered there be an acceptable impact on local junctions and the free flow of traffic and vehicles. There's a net increase of town centre parking. Temporary car parking would be provided and ensure the town centre is well served during the construction period. Cycle parking would be provided in accordance with London Plan policies, including public cycle stands in the form of Sheffield stands in the public realm. A travel plan would be secured within Section 106, again seeking to reduce reliance on less sustainable modes of transport, i.e. the car. And car club spaces are proposed as part of the package as well. There's wider Section 106 contributions, which I'll come to in a moment. In terms of sustainability, the application meets the policy requirements. An energy centre in CHP will be provided in Phase 1, which would alone reduce CO2 emissions by 33%. Building efficiency and green roofs are also proposed. These would be secured for each phase, an energy statement would be required for each future phase as well. In terms of accessibility, I've talked about lifetime homes and wheelchair housing. There's obviously the relevant disabled parking spaces in accordance with policy. The landscape master plan allows for much enhanced accessibility across the site in the public realm, including a new pedestrian ramp alongside the Ham and Workhouse stock, connecting the sites. The Section 106 mitigation package is outlined in the report, where there's contributions to affordable housing, education, public transport, amongst other things. So overall, it's considered, and the report concludes that the development would have a positive impact on the 3 strands of sustainable development as given in the NPPF, and it complies with the development plan. So approval, subject to safeguarding conditions, and the Section 106 is recommended.
Right. Questions for the officer? Yeah, Mal.
I have a number. First of all, have at any time during the discussions, as was highlighted in the presentation by the objectors, have you spoken to the developer about reversing the plan to actually build from the waterside coming to the high street rather than the high street going to the waterside, which would have a significant bearing on this particular site and probably be much more beneficial? My next question is on car parking spaces, because there are more commercial car parking spaces and there are residential car parking spaces, and bearing in mind that most of that part of Brentford and West Brentford has now got CPZs, how can you actually justify the balance? My next question is on the lanes, and whilst I'm sure everybody here welcomes the reintroduction of the lanes as part of the heritage, what is not clear from the presentation, either by the developers or yourself, is the security of those lanes, particularly at night time. I now want to talk a little about the housing, and then I have one further question to ask. Most applications of this size would produce an affordable housing ratio of much greater than 10%. Now, we're actually only looking here, and you said up to 80 dwelling spaces, which is even more worrying than 10%, because if it is up to 80, it's actually even less than 10%. We as councillors are faced with a devastating housing crisis, and with greatest of respect to the developers, the other 796 or whatever it's going to be are going to be way outside of the reach of most of the people who live in Brentford, and neither will they actually contribute to the economy of the town either. So I would hope that there would be some kind of space to renegotiate that 10% to what is more realistic, of between 20% and 41%, which is the acceptable levels. And I draw your attention to what they've done at the close by Reynard Mills site. My final point at this particular stage, and I might want to come back later, but my final point is on the vicarage itself. The vicarage has a specific use. Can I ask whether you have negotiated the relocation of the people that use that, either through Section 106 or by some other method, to ensure that the actual residents who use that as for a very specific and important use are actually looked after and allocated? Technically not a planning matter, however, as the building is going to be demolished, I think it then does become a planning matter because of the vulnerability of the people that are using it.
Thank you, Councillor. Taking your first question in terms of the designing from the waterside, I think that has been done in this case. I think the connectivity between the high street and the waterside is obviously a key driving factor between the layout and the urban grain that's created. The reinvigorating the waterside and creating public realm around it, reopening the docks, I think is fundamental to the design. In terms of the taller buildings, which are positioned on the waterside, I think that they enhance the legibility and are appropriately placed. So I think that has been done. I think in terms of car parking, in terms of car parking, there is a ratio of residential, which is 0.6 residential unit overall. That's towards the higher end of the council's parking standards. It's considered that's an appropriate balance based on the surrounding context. Again, TfL would be actually seeking a reduction in that parking provision. We feel that is acceptable and wouldn't result in overspill parking. And again, like I said, it has been reduced from what the applicant originally proposed. The Section 106 would secure funding for CPZs further CPZ if that's required, but we will actually be seeking to reduce the residential parking as phases come forward in favour of more sustainable modes of transport, and the travel plan would have quite stringent targets for the applicant or the developer to meet in terms of encouraging people to use those more sustainable modes of transport. And such as giving residents, just one of the measures is to provide future residents with sustainability vouchers that they can obviously put towards car clubs, cycle equipment and that sort of thing. So I think it's overall, when you look at a holistic package, I think it's the right approach, and the limit is the limit on 0.66, which it would be a safeguarding condition as well, is acceptable. In terms of the security of the lanes, they would obviously be overlooked by the residential developments with natural surveillance and activity. There would also be CCTV as part of a safeguarding condition, and I dare say site management. I think the applicant already alluded to concierge and site management within the blocks, which will also help with the security. And again, for me, that compared to the existing site, the development offers the wider area a significant enhancement in safety and security. The affordable housing point, I will pass on to Andrew Jones.
Hello, my name is Andrew Jones. As said, I'm an independent viability consultant. I'm a chartered surveyor by training. One way or another, I've been involved in this scheme for nearly 16 years, off and on, more off than on. And it has, throughout that time, faced a considerable number of challenges. It's a very, very large block of land, and it's in an environment which isn't very pleasant at the moment. So any development that's going to come forward has got to look to a holistic development, not just of one phase, but several phases, and it's got to be able to build a momentum, and it's got to be able to build a credible offer to the people that live and work there. So in looking at the viability from the point of view of a planning perspective, you have to look at current costs and values to drive that. So we're looking at an environment for phase one, which is surrounded by the remaining as yet unbuilt phases, and there is a time frame that that's going to take to come forward. And it's a big leap of faith for any developer to put a lot of money into the ground to see property come out in the anticipation that they're going to sell it for the values that they're looking to achieve. The viability to deliver 10% affordable housing isn't predicated on current values. It's predicated on what the scheme as a whole will generate over its life. So it has some significant challenges to do that. The blocks where they're built are not able to provide car parking within blocks, by and large. So car parking is provided at distance. That's going to affect values. Build costs are growing at a substantial rate, so there's a certain amount of having to factor those aspects into this. So in looking at the actual provision of 10%, we were far from convinced that actually this scheme could genuinely deliver it with certainty on current costs and values. And therefore our biggest concern was about securing provision of that quantum rather than necessarily seeing it coming in an incremental basis. To that end, and the reason why it's put in as an addendum as a land transactions is because we've secured, through the fact that the council in effect controls the ability to deliver phase one through the ownership of County Parade, a requirement to provide the money and the land to deliver the affordable housing up front, so that it's secured, it's not capable of being revisited, and that's a minimum provision. The second aspect to it is that that isn't where the story ends. Developers clearly working on the assumption of a growth in values, and we wish them well with that, otherwise you won't get a comprehensive scheme coming forward, and that is another key requirement for this. And that's one of the factors driving densities and driving values. However, if they are successful, then the council also benefits, because if they achieve normal developer profit, then the council will secure a further 50% of any additionality over and above that level. And I would just make one final point here. This site has taken a considerable number of years to assemble, and that process isn't quite finished yet, but it's largely assembled. There is a significant holding cost and a significant historic cost for that land. We've driven a coach and horses through much of that assessment, and we've asked the developer to ignore a lot of those costs, and they have taken a substantial hit on their historic costs to deliver the 10% that's here. So I'm convinced for a number of reasons that that is the maximum that can be delivered within the context both of the council's current land ownerships, but also within the context of the viability and future viability of this scheme. However, we do have this all-important safeguard of further reviews in the event that it does make more money than we're anticipating.
Can I just pick up on the last point regarding the vicarage? It is temporary accommodation at the moment, and we will be looking at housing them in another temporary accommodation, or indeed, if possible, in permanent accommodation.
Can I just come back to two?
Okay. No, yeah.
Taking Mr. Jones's point on County Parade being the council's asset in order to get this affordable housing, is that the reason why the council can't negotiate with the? Going back to my first point, is that the reason why the council is not negotiating with the developer to actually start the development phases by going from the waterfront up towards the high street rather than from the high street towards the waterfront, as was eloquently demonstrated by our objectors when they were doing their presentation. And whilst I've got the mic, on the question of parking and traffic flows, when you were doing the parking and the potential traffic flows, did you take into account the impact on the blue light, and particularly the impact on West Middlesex Hospital, bearing in mind that it's going to become a major hospital with an expanded A&E?
First of all, I should add that there is a separation, obviously, between the council as landowner and the council as planning authority. The negotiations around the sale of County Parade have been negotiated by the relevant council officers and another consultancy, Aspinall Verde, and the terms there have secured market value for the council's interest. The tie-in in relation to the planning application is that County Parade is essential for the delivery of phase one. So whilst the actual market terms for that sale have been agreed, the actual timing of the sale is conditional upon securing the affordable housing. That's where we've used that leverage, if you see what I mean. It's not had any impact on the design of the phase. The phase has been designed in detail as a substantive phase to give enough volume and quantum to generate the impact to raise values from the current area as it stands at the moment of dereliction and an environment in which people wouldn't want to live and work, to give enough bulk and massing to make an environment where those values are more likely to be achieved. So it's not had any impact on design in that sense.
Councillor, my name is Phil Marshall. I'm from JMP. We've been advising the council on the acceptability of the transport work that's been undertaken. In terms of your query about blue light access, that isn't typically modelled within traffic modelling. However, the network has sufficient availability for vehicles to move to one side to let blue light access through as required. And it has never been raised as an issue by TfL, and I wouldn't expect it to be an issue with this scheme.
With respect, through the chair, TfL may not have been aware of West Middlesex becoming a major hospital, or at least that section of it.
But it's not something that would normally be expected to cause a major issue on a network. People react differently if there's a red blue light behind them to someone else waiting behind them. So people will move aside for blue lights, and the scheme won't impede that in any way.
Right, further questions? Yeah, Shaida, John, and Shantanu. Yeah.
Having listened to the views of the people from Brentford, I'm rather concerned that what's actually been addressed by the council to try and alleviate some of the issues that they do have, and in future what will be done to try and give them a peace of mind.
In terms of, are we focusing on design, do you mean? In terms of the design, as I said, the remaining 8 development blocks would be required to formal applications to be made again. They would be subject to consultation from ourselves. I would strongly suspect that the applicant would be consulting with neighbouring people as part of the development of those designs prior to it coming to us. And again, we would be looking to use the design code and looking at the 3 blocks that are detailed at the moment and trying to get that added variety. So I would hope that there is scope for some of the variety that some of the objectors seek to be provided within those remaining 8 blocks. I think it's important that only 3 are in detail and 8 are still up for grabs, so to speak. And I think I dare say there'll be, not trying to do any architects out of a job, but there may well be different architects working on different plots again. And so I would very much expect there to be additional variety across the site.
Sorry, but I want to go back to section the affordable housing. I'm confused, and I'm looking at pages 74, 75 and paragraphs 99 and 100 on page 77. But I want to ask Mr. Jones and or his colleagues some quick questions, so if we can have a quick repartee, it will save time. What sort of units are we building in this Block D?
There is an effective constraint on the numbers of units that are dictated by the overall numbers that are within the planning application for the scheme as a whole. But within the block itself, the council has flexibility to provide for need at the time that the actual application is capable of coming forward. At the moment, there remains to be 1 or 2 land interests that need to be acquired, so there could be a potential delay if a CPO was required. But at the point that a detailed design comes forward for Block D, it will reflect the best mix that is deemed appropriate by the housing team for this area and for need. So we have the opportunity to possibly have bigger units, might result in fewer units overall, but actually the overall number of habitable rooms will be the same.
Well, you've completely lost it there. It's a fantastic mandate. I mean, that's a fantastic open-ended mandate I've ever heard of. So when the report somewhere says 80 units, that's a speculative figure, is it?
No, the master plan as it's designed for this particular block is for 80 units, but those 80 units total an overall floor area, and that floor area would translate into a mix of unit sizes, 1, 2 and some 3-bed units. The council has the flexibility within that mix to have a higher proportion, say, of 3-bed units and fewer 1-bed units if it felt that's where the greatest need was for providing units. So as such, it's not constrained in that sense.
That's very good. Well, how do we rebut the suggestion that LBH is subsidising Ballymore? Because they decided for some reason to build Block D and to look for this third party for up to £7 million so-called viability shortfall. Is this a subsidy or not?
Let me be clear. The intention is that Ballymore would transfer the land and any money that is required to acquire the remaining land interests in Block D as a site to the council for nil consideration. In addition, it would also give the council a further £7 million, that's the estimated figure as it stands today, to plug any gap in constructing that block as entirely affordable housing.
Well, what is your projected cost of building that block?
The figures from memory are somewhere in the region of 29 million. So the actual value of the affordable housing offsets the costs, but then the value of the affordable housing is not as great as the actual cost of construction. So in order to deliver it at nil cost to the council, it needs, in effect, a cross-subsidy from Ballymore of £7 million and the land to be provided for nil, which is the basis on which we're looking at.
Can I repeat my question? What's it going to cost Hounslow to build Block D?
Absolutely nothing.
So you're saying the £7 million to cover that?
Yes, not only that, but there is provision within the heads of terms for Ballymore to top up any deficit.
Okay, my last question then, in Appendix 3 of the amended report, there's mention of 219 habitable rooms. Page 13 of the addendum. Worst case scenario, appraisal A. Third paragraph down.
I go back to my point really that the habitable rooms are what can be created out of the floor space there. The configuration as to whether that's all 1-bed units, 3-bed units is within the flexibility of the council.
Thank you very much. Right, Shan.
Thank you, Chair. Just focusing in on air quality for a second, Sonny. I'm a little bit confused. Part of the report on page 84 talks about how the entire borough is in an area of air quality management area, suggesting that there's high air pollution. But then the report goes on to say that that's fine because we've got mitigation in place, certainly in construction phase, and then in operational phase we'll encourage people to use cycles and public transport, which to me sounds very aspirational. I suppose my question really is, how are we going to enforce this? We've got a load of undertakings certainly on construction phase, but looking at the heads of term, there doesn't seem to be anything in the appendix and the heads of term around penalties or enforcement. I don't know whether it's normal to have it in there or not, and certainly with the 6 minutes, there could be a little bit less. Certainly, even 2 or 3 minutes, as far as I'm concerned, is a long time. And if we're in an area of high air pollution, that won't help at all. So I'm a little bit confused on that. And then I've got another question, which I'll ask in a sec.
Okay. In terms of air quality, the whole borough is within an air quality management area. I think the report talks about the impact of this particular development. In terms of the mitigation, obviously during construction, there's various processes that can be done to minimise dust and pollutants going into the air. I think the travel plan, which again would be in a 106, so would be followed up. There are targets within that to improve for the developer to reduce the reliance on the private car for more sustainable modes of transport, and the infrastructure improvements in terms of cycle lanes and connectivity in terms of walking, as well as providing services close to housing, obviously reduces the need to travel. That would be tested, and there are implications if the modal shifts aren't achieved. The development obviously results in probably removal of some of the dirtier, if I can say that, industries at the site, which would also potentially help. And there's a significant net increase in planting as well. So I think in overall that the scheme itself is acceptable. Obviously the traffic issue, the idea is eventually to try and promote less reliance on those vehicles, which would reduce the traffic flows. But again, like I say, what we do is within the travel plan.
Sorry, Chair, just on that, I understand what you're saying, but I would imagine that if you've got heads of terms before us, that would be reflected somewhere in the head of term, either as a head of term saying, if you don't do this, or we will monitor this in this way. This is what we would expect to do, and I'm not seeing that in this. I don't know whether it is there or it should be there. I
think the travel plan, somewhere in the report anyway, does mention that the modal shift targets and the monitoring and what the remedial measures would be. I think generally in terms of conditions on 106, they obviously are enforceable. We don't generally write that in a report, but obviously breach of conditions enforceable. Breach of the section 106 is probably, well, can I say a more serious breach? No, not more serious, but It is enforceable, is the point. So, you know, if the measures aren't followed through, then we would seek enforcement action.
Okay, and just one last one, if I may. If I can draw your attention to page 11 of the addendum report, section 7, further discussions between Council and Ballymore, call 7.1, clause 3.1.4.3b. Could you explain that to me, please? Because that to me says, I'm afraid, that Ballymore will meet the shortfall, maybe to a certain point, perhaps.
I think the point about this is that this scheme has to be fundable. You know, at the end of the day, the primary objection to anything that is an open-ended commitment is that no one is going to sign up to an open-ended commitment without some quantification of the risks that are involved. So the exercises that have been undertaken to date have been to look at, bearing in mind this is a scheme in outline, is to look at a best and worst case scenario for what that scheme will actually cost to develop. So the figure that's in the agreement at the moment looks likely to be a realistic level of subsidy that's required. There is a worst case scenario which puts a financial limit as to what the developer will have to provide, but it will only be negotiated at a point when we've got a detailed consent and we've actually got to the point where we can press the button and say, yes, we know what we're dealing with. And at that point, that's the logical point for the developer as well, to be securing the finance for the development, and so that there will be a finite sum. It's a question of doing the homework and getting everything in the right place at the right time, but certainly the heads of terms make provision for that. So there should still be no risk in there, but it is an obvious requirement for the developer to be able to go forward with.
Right. Other questions? No? Right. Well, throw it open to debate.